Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We hope you're keeping very, very safe and well. Thank you so much for joining us for a very early summer transfer window update Monday. I know many people are still getting over, of course, that result at Stamford Bridge. A big point for Tottenham in the circumstances. We have got a very special guest joining us who will be with us in a very short time. A couple of minutes ago, he was here. He's on his way back now into the arena. This is what happens when you go backstage. It is like Jonathan Ross. They may turn up, they may not. Joining me for, again, another summer transfer window update, I've got the brilliant Matty Hayes. Matty runs a superb Spurs YouTube channel. Matty, how are you? Lovely to be back on Last One on Spurs.
Absolute pleasure to be on as always, Ricky. I'm looking forward to another fantastic show, another fantastic conversation about Tottenham's transfer dealings. And I feel like we're at the point where if you get a list of Tottenham's best journalists, you get a list of Last Word on Spurs guests. They're almost identical at this point, so it's always fun to be on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, mate. Listen, we've been very lucky. We've been blessed to be joined by a number of top-tier journalists over the course of the summer who've been with the club throughout pre-season, on tour in South Korea, on tour in Israel as well, and of course seeing Spurs all through the journey. Joining us tonight, we've got senior football writer for SunSport. We've got the great Tom Barclay on Last One on Spurs. Tom, love to have you on Last One on Spurs. How are you?
Very well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on, Ricky. I'm aware that I've only actually relatively recently started covering Spurs back end of last season, so nice to be asked already, and I'm hoping my internet holds out.
Oh, we are too. We're hoping so. Fingers crossed. Just for obviously viewers out there, listeners, Tom, I think it's worth mentioning that you've, let's say, over the course of the summer, you've seen Spurs up close, personal in South Korea, in Israel. Yes. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the show to be able to maybe dive a little bit deeper into what it was like covering the club over pre-season, seeing the likes of Sessegnon, some of the English players up close and personal as well. But listen, we first have to ask you and just reflect on a crazy day for Tottenham yesterday up at Stamford Bridge, a game where Spurs, I think twice, didn't look like they were going to get anything from the game and come back to miraculously get themselves a point in probably one of the most poorest performances we've seen from Tottenham under Antonio Conte, but yet they leave Stamford Bridge with a point. What did you make of yesterday's result up at the Bridge?
Yeah, I was at the game. It was absolutely mad, particularly from a journalist point of view. I don't know if the other guys have been on, have really sort of talked through the logistics of when you're covering a match, when there's late goals that go in that change the complete context of it, like Kane's did. It can be quite stressful, put it that way, when you're trying to get a report done pretty much, well, as we say, on the whistle. Or I was doing a colour piece, actually. So the phrase colour piece. So a match report is more of a straight kind of what happened, blow by blow action. We try and make it quite creative, obviously, but a colour piece is more like looking at one particular subject, perhaps, and going in a bit of a deeper dive on that. Albeit, obviously, at the Sun we have a shorter word count than some other papers. My theme, I had a few different ones throughout the game because things kept changing. At the end of it, when that goal went in, it sort of changed everything. So I just started writing from scratch pretty much at that moment and turned it around about in a few minutes. It was about basically how one of the comments that Antonio Conte had made during pre-season, I think it was during our time in Korea, he said that one of his targets this season was to make Tottenham not to make other teams not scared, but a bit worried about when they played Tottenham, make them a bit nastier, have more of a backbone perhaps. And I think that's kind of what we saw yesterday, because as you said, it wasn't a great performance, perhaps one of the more poor performances in recent times under Antonio Conte, but yet they came away with the result. They dug it out. And I have to say, I think the introduction of Richarlison in particular changed the game into Spurs' favour. It's not like he had any particular chances, but it was just his running, his energy, the way the system changed when he came on, which was really interesting because you think of Antonio Conte as quite wedded to that 3-4-3, and then suddenly when he was preparing to come on, because we could see him right in front of because at Chelsea or right behind the dugout in the press area, you see him coming on. I just sort of presumed it would be for Kulusevski because he was having one of those games that was pretty ineffectual, which is quite rare for him, to be fair. But the fact that he kept him on, kept the three of them on, and put Richarlison on was really interesting. And his sort of energy and his his willingness to get into opponents' faces, which is what I feel like one of the reasons they liked him in the first place and wanted to sign him, sort of spoke to this idea of teams being not scared but worried about Tottenham, and that was this season. That was the first real example of us seeing it.
Absolutely. Matty, coming over to you. Have you recovered yet from that performance up at the bridge?
Do you know what? This may be a sin, but I haven't actually seen it yet. So I was working all day yesterday, and I only got out of work today at 6:30. I've seen the extended highlights, and I've seen every single comment that was there. But I have to say, we was Sky Sports News on up in the office, and I was keeping an eye on every minute that was taken by, just waiting for something to come through. And I kind of lost the hope. But then it ticked through that Kane scored the goal. And look, watching it back, it was a crazy way to do it, and in a way that is so the opposite of what you'd expect of Tottenham. You know, a fantastic delivery from the corner. From Ivan Perisic, which has kind of been our weak point in recent years. But I just have to say, whether the performance was the best we've ever had or the worst we've ever had, we've become the team that we used to always lose to. You know, that team with Romero screaming in Reece James's face after the equaliser, with Antonio Conte getting into tussles on the sideline, with Richarlison, celebrating that goal. I think everyone probably thought he'd scored it when that happened. So it's nice to see Tottenham be that team, like Tom said, that team that people are worried about. People may be a bit intimidated of coming up against. And I know Conte said it, but even in the business, the transfer dealings we've done this summer, he's signing big physical players, and the fact that it's already starting to pay off in a ground where it very rarely does for us, it's great to see. But I hope things are a little bit more convincing maybe in our future games.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tom, listen, we will discuss obviously where we've been in terms of the summer transfer window now. These have been regular updates on Last Word on Spurs every week. We've had really top-tier journalists coming on, telling us their thoughts on Spurs' summer transfer window. So we're absolutely delighted to have you on to get your thoughts on it. I mean, Spurs, as we know, they've spent really big this summer to some degree. We've seen Conte lead Spurs back into the Champions League. We're already 4 points up on the fixtures in reverse of last season. We've seen Spurs get over the line. Ivan Perisic, who was a real difference maker for Tottenham yesterday, provided the corner, of course, for Harry Kane to score that late equaliser. Yves Bissouma, Richarlison, Clement Longley, Jed Spence and Fraser Forster all signing for the club. We know that it looks like Destiny Adugi is also going to be putting pen to paper soon and then heading back, obviously, off to Udinese on loan for the rest of the season. But overall, Tom, what have you made of Spurs' summer transfer window so far, if I can still say so far, because there's still some hope they might do something more?
Massively impressive. You can only be impressed, can't you? I mean, I've watched Tottenham over the years and what they've done in the transfer market, and this is actually the first window I've had covering specifically Tottenham, and you sort of prepare yourself for some last minute action, because that's often what seems to happen with Spurs, and maybe there might still be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't, because they've done so much good business already. Every single one that's come in has fitted with, you can understand why they've gone for them. There's no sort of scattergun approach at all. Conte has used this phrase actually in the last couple of press conferences about common sense signings, common sense approach to transfers. He himself has also said that he's not, what's the phrase used? Not foolish enough to think that he can have everything he wants straight away. He realizes that, again, coming back to this common sense, that this takes time. And yet it's quite rare, as all you guys who followed Spurs for so long, to have all these players through the door already. I love the signing of Richarlison, and yesterday proved why he's such a canny buy, because those front three are about as good as there's anything already in the Premier League. So you need someone who's going to offer something a bit different, who can fill in all those positions, who like when you look at his stats, right, maybe he hasn't scored loads of goals, loads of assists, but the amount of times he does something that changes the impotence of the game. I mean, yeah, so like yesterday, a perfect example. I don't think he would have got, he wouldn't have got an assist for either goals, but I feel like he was quite crucial to the turnarounds, and that's a great signing. Yves Bissouma is someone that I've watched for a long time. So for context, before I covered Spurs, the last few years I've been doing the South Coast, effectively, of the Premier League. So your Brightons, your Southamptons, your Bournemouths when you were there, and then sort of the lesser big clubs in London like Crystal Palace, and before that the Football League as well, for 4 years, which can come on to, as well as the under-21 team. But Yves Bissouma, when covering Brighton, is someone I've watched regularly. He always seems to have his best games against the biggest teams. So I've the last couple of years I've watched the games where Brighton have gone to Stamford Bridge, and I think last year they drew 1-1, and the year before drew 0-0. He was the best player on the pitch, amazing athleticism. You just look at him and he just feels like he fits Conte's style perfectly. So Højbjerg, who we spoke to in the press mix zone yesterday after the game, I think you've seen the quotes already today. which is more the most interesting part is talking about the sendings off of the managers. But he also talks about the competition for places, and he himself was saying, well, that's how it used to be when I was at Bayern Munich as a youngster. You need 2 players in each position. You need pressure on your own position from another player. And that's exactly what Spurs have got now in that middle of the midfield with those 4 players of Skip, Bentancur, Bissouma and Højbjerg. So that's only going to push them on further. And then, yeah, I mean, I can continue really. Like all of the signings are interesting. I mean, and perhaps Spurs fans might have been hoping for that sort of big money left-sided centre-back signing this summer. They seem to have parked that maybe for next year and gone with Longley on a loan, which is not a free hit, but someone that they can see how it goes for that loan. If he impresses and does really well, then they can maybe look to sign him, albeit they don't have an obligation or an option in the loan deal rather. So they'd have to work something out. And funny enough, we spoke to him as well out in Korea, and he said he didn't know what the future would hold for him. But I think that's quite a sensible stopgap at the very least, and maybe more than that. And then Perisic, is probably the player that I'm most looking forward to seeing. Albeit I'd feel bad for Ryan Sessegnon losing his position if that were to happen. But he's a winner. Everyone seems to respect him. Yesterday, I was watching him before he came on, and because obviously there were drinks breaks halfway through the halves, and during the first drinks break, most of it was the team obviously on the pitch and the coaching staff and Conte leading it. But Perisic was I think the one sub who was also over there giving Ryan Sessegnon advice during the game. Well, he seemed to be, he was talking to him, but also as he walked around to do his warm up, he gave a handshake or high five with Thomas Tuchel as he walked past, back when everything was going a bit less sort of aggressive between the two dugouts. But I can't remember if he's been. I mean, he's obviously at Bayern Munich, wasn't he? So I don't think he's worked under Tuchel. I think it just speaks to the respect that he commands across the game because of what he's done. So yeah, he's another really exciting one. I could go on about these guys. I think it's a really sensible approach to transfers this summer.
Absolutely. Let's pass over to Matty. Matty, over to you.
Yeah, I think sensible and Antonio Conte go hand in hand, and along with that, and the 150 million pounds that Tottenham have put into the club this summer, it's really clear that they are backing the manager, and it's something we as fans have been calling for quite a while. Kind of felt we didn't really get, but it looks as though the tide has turned somewhat for Spurs in that capacity. Reports are out there still. I see people mentioning centre attacking mid in the comments, and as well potentially another defender with Joe Rodon on his way to France, and Jaffa Tanganga's future is still in doubt. But at the moment, the focus is very much on outgoings, excluding what we're hoping is the imminent signing of Destiny Udogie. Are there any other positions that you think Tottenham will fill between now and the end of the window, or is it solely just getting the I don't want to call him Deadwood, but the likes of Ndombele, Lo Celso out of the club?
I don't think you can guarantee any new incomes. That doesn't mean to say there won't be, but it's not like before we thought, I'm pretty sure right wing back, left centre back, they'll be bringing in these positions. Now I think they're in a bit quite a kind of position that you want to be in, where they don't need to if the right thing doesn't come up. And that's very much what I've been sort of led to believe at this point. First of all, as you rightly say, it's about getting rid of the players that they don't no longer want. I mean, Conte's in public being very respectful of the 4 players that he didn't take with him to either Korea or Israel, and obviously have been training on their own. Lo Celso has gone. Ndombele, I think there's a long way to go on that one. Yes, they are in talks with Napoli. I think there were suggestions that he might have been going over to Italy, but I checked with the club today, this morning, and he was still at Hotspur Way, presumably training. Although actually they often have the day off after a game, so I'm not sure if they would have been in. But he's still in London, and I think presumably what with his wages and the kind of fee or that they'd be looking for, it might take some negotiating on that part. They would have liked to have sold all 4 of those players. And as you can already see from Lo Celso, they're having to look at loans instead, just because they're struggling to find buyers. I think a big part of that is, still COVID. The hit and the knock-on effect of that in Europe means there's just not as much money going about. The Celso deal is quite interesting, really. Bear in mind that he, got them to the Champions League semi-final. You think there would be Villarreal will be really looking to get him, but because they haven't made any big sales themselves, I mean, the likes of Danjuma, who I remember covering at Bournemouth, didn't go. He's still there. Means they've gone for a loan, and it's interesting that there's no obligation there. There's no option of actually it's. There's a chance of Spurs breaking it in January, which is a pretty common thing. So, for example, Conor Gallagher's loan to Palace last season had a break clause in January if they wanted to do it, but there was no desire on anyone's behalf to do that. That is quite a common thing. But maybe with Lo Celso, the hope will be have a really good first half of the season, and then maybe they can sell him in January either to Villarreal or somewhere else. And then the same goes with Harry Winks and Sergio Reguilon. I mean, there was a bit of interest from Sevilla, but they've obviously gone for Alex Telles when it comes to Reguilon. So kind of back to square one on that one. And Harry Winks, Sevilla's another team. Sampdoria's been a bit of interest from abroad, but it doesn't seem to be coming to anything at the moment. There are some Premier League teams, I'm led to believe anyway, that are sort of monitoring his situation. But I mean, it seems crazy to think that he would be left stuck at Tottenham by the end of the window, given how many caps he's got for England, his age. I mean, all these guys have got they're relatively young. They're all 25, 26, and they've got loads to offer. So you'd think something can work out. But I think from a Spurs fan perspective, and definitely the club, the sort of hope that they'd be generating, serious income from selling these guys is their hopes of that are sort of fading a little bit, and it's looking more at loans at this point.
I was going to ask you, Tom, about Conte's happiness, but rather than me asking you about that, I just want to maybe ask you about those four players, the quartet we've mentioned. Obviously, Lo Celso now has gone to Villarreal respectively now on another season-long loan. As we understand it, I think there's an option where Spurs can basically recall the player in January, or they've got an option to accept other bids. Is that right? If a bid comes in suitable that the player also likes the sound of?
So that's what I'm saying. So basically, like actually a lot of loans, it's just they don't often come to light. You can have what's called a break clause midway through the season during that January window where the parent club can end the loan, bring them back, maybe loan them out again. I used Conor Gallagher as an example. In fact, here is a prime example, again, involving Gallagher when he was on loan at Charlton for his first loan in the Championship when no one really knew much about him, and he had a brilliant first half of the season. Chelsea ended it in January and loaned him off to Swansea for the second half of the season. So that's an example of that. And I think that's the same situation with Lo Celso. They could bring him back, and then maybe if they get an offer, then that could be a possibility.
Okay. I mean, I just wondered, Tom, before I hand over to Matty, how I won't say the word damaging, but how frustrating is that for those players to be around that? I mean, when I'm saying the likes of Ndombele now, Harry Winks, Sergio Reguilon, players that essentially are not involved in Conte's plans. As we understand it, they're training away from the group. I mean, do you get the feeling that that can't be ideal at Hotspur way for the players that obviously they want to carry on their careers? Can't be easy being around that. What vibe do you get around the camp?
Yeah, that's well, it's no player wants that, particularly a player that's, as I said, they should be in their sort of peak years at 25, 26, which all four of those guys are. And it's difficult. It's a difficult market, it seems to be, particularly abroad. Things are taking their time, and it must be very frustrating, having to wait and wait and see, because I don't think if they do end up staying, they can't move them on, whether there'll be space for them to be in the squad, because it's pretty much at max capacity as it is. I mean, there's some very specific quotas that they need to fill with this the squad regarding Champions League and the Premier League. So, for example, I think there's been a fair bit of speculation about Japhet Tanganga this summer, but he's one of the homegrown players. So if he leaves, there is a gap for the four homegrown players you need, I think, for the Premier League, because the obvious ones would be Kane, obviously, Oliver Skipp, Tanganga, and I think Brandon Austin fits in that. So if one of those goes, then I think Harvey White might be the most likely to fill that. Right. Obviously, Harry Winks would fit in that, so maybe that might give him slight door open, but I'm not here. That's just me speculating that he would fit that because he's obviously a homegrown player. But all the word is about moving these guys on, and fingers crossed from their point of view for everyone, that would be the best thing to happen.
Absolutely. What we will just very quickly do, we will go for our first break of the show. For our listeners that are on audio, for our watching us on YouTube, we are battling Monday Night Football, and we've still got 500 of you plus across all of our platforms watching us live. So thank you so much, as always, for all of your support for Last Word on Spurs. I'm going to hand over to Matty.
Yeah, just before we suppose go into more detail on Tottenham's squad for this season, one player that won't be in the squad till next season is, of course, Destiny Udogie, as you mentioned earlier on. Tottenham reportedly agreeing a deal to sign the player from Udinese, an initial £15 million up front, with some performance-related bonuses on top of that. And again, go back to Udinese for the season. When do you think, or is there any insight maybe into when that deal could be announced? Because we saw pictures yesterday of the player making his way to London for what we believe is his medical.
Yeah, he had his medical today, I believe. Yeah, so I'd be very confident of that happening. Not that, as I said, I haven't checked in because I've been off, but I knew he was having his medical today. So, but I haven't seen any of the other guys. I mean, you'll know all the regulars who come, the likes of Ali Gold at Football London. Any suggestions that anything's gone wrong on that front? So, yeah, you'd likely think that would be wrapped up and sealed by this week at some point. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after that. But as you rightly say, Matty, he's going to be loaned back to Udinese. He's a player that I guess Udinese are going to suddenly have a big Spurs following this season, seeing how he's getting on. One for the future, obviously, but it sounds like one that obviously you identified Paratici and Conte is excited about him, and that position is an interesting one because obviously Sessegnon seems to really be rising to the challenge of just let alone Udogie, but Perisic coming into the club. He's he obviously looks physically bigger this season. He had a fantastic first game against Southampton, took his goal really well, and all right, Chelsea game was a bit tougher, but I can't say that many of the team had sort of standout games really in that one. So it's a bit unfair to sort of single him out. But overall, he's been looking very good. And then obviously Perisic, yes, he's 33 and will be 34 by the time Udogie would come back next season. But don't write him off because he looks like an absolute, amazing athlete. We haven't obviously seen it happen yet in the Premier League on a starting basis, and let's see how he copes with a full season. But he played loads of games for Inter Milan last year, so you wouldn't write him off either. So just overall, it's just really good forward planning from Tottenham. At least it looks like that on the face of it. One of the young players that seems to be on his way to becoming a full Italy international. That there are even hopes that he might be that at some point this season, and that's just a position they now look like they've got good cover and exciting players for many years to come.
I'm conscious. I'm going to let Matty ask you about potentially the player profile Spurs might want in terms of players coming up, and also about Lo Celso. I'm just keen to ask you, Tom. You mentioned Sessegnon there. I know it's a player you've watched, at length when you've obviously covered England in your time as well. I think yesterday there's almost that assertion that maybe Sessegnon in the big games, is he going to be able to mentally step up to that level? And then obviously we see Perisic in the space of 15, 20 minutes come on, provide a game-changing moment to get Spurs level. Having watched Sessegnon up close like you have personally, do you have the confidence, or do you believe that he will become nailed on Spurs' fullback for the future? Because you do feel with Udogie coming in, and as you've mentioned, Perisic is one of those players that could still potentially have another couple of years in him. Is there real pressure on Sessegnon this season to really deliver in a Spurs shirt? How do you gauge it in terms of that battle on the left-hand side? Because I feel like for Spurs fans, the jury is still out on Sess. For me, I've been a big fan of him. I think there's something about him. There's a spark in him that I didn't see him regular on, but still yesterday gives me... I'm still slightly anxious about whether he's good enough for Tottenham long term. I'm just intrigued to know your thoughts are on that, Tom.
Well, I mean, I as I was saying before I even covered the Premier League stuff, I was the paper's football league reporter, mainly covering sort of championship football, and I watched Fulham a lot. So that season during that time, but it was all over the country. But it was the teams that were doing particularly well, I'd watch a lot. So. I remember the season where Slavisa Jokanovic got Fulham promoted via the playoffs when Tom Kearney scored the winner. But Sessegnon was so good in that season, albeit playing more of a left-sided forward, really, left winger, but kind of where Son plays really now for Tottenham, scoring loads of goals. That I even thought at the time, I think this was ahead of the 2018 World Cup, that he might have even been a bit of a mad outside shout for the England squad. And that wasn't just me. Jukanovic himself said it too. So I'm, very excited about him from an early age. And it's been so far until sort of back end of last season, it's been disappointing and sort of sad to see how he's got on at Spurs, largely because of injuries. They've obviously changed managers. Trying to find his right position has been an issue. It doesn't seem like before when whoever's been in charge has gone with a back four, he's been trusted as a left back, and then not really hasn't proved enough in the Premier League as that left-sided sort of forward. And obviously Son plays there, so it's always going to be difficult to dislodge him. I feel like under Conte with this 3-4-3, playing a wing back suits him as well as anything that I've seen at Tottenham. And obviously I haven't watched them as much as you have in the recent years, but from afar watching him, it feels like that really does suit him well. So, and he seems to really respond very well to Conte's demands. And like I said, over the summer, he spent his time before coming to pre-season bulking up, using one of the personal trainers who works with boxers to get physically bigger. And you can tell, like, when you watch him, he does look stronger. And when we talked about that when we spoke to him out in Korea, but he also talked about his 2 goals this season were to score goals and get more assists, because I don't think he scored at all last season. Maybe got 1 or 2 assists, but he definitely is something that he wants to do more of. He's had, all right, against Chelsea, maybe didn't have the best game, but from overall target, he got one against Southampton, and could have had another. I think goal ruled out. And actually against Chelsea, he had that great chance, didn't he, in the first half as well. So yep. I think those wing-back positions are so crucial to the way Tottenham want to play, of the goal threat they can bring. And I think he's shown back in the season, in pre-season and in these first few games, that he might have the capability to do that long term. But I think it's fair also for Tottenham fans to have the jury still out on him, because he just hasn't been fit enough. He hasn't probably impressed enough during his time now. And it does really feel like this season, with Udogie sort of waiting in the wings and Perisic here at the moment, which he can learn a lot from, this is his chance to really show that he is the future of Spurs. And I personally think he's got the talent to do it. So I'm hoping that he does.
Amen.
My favourite thing about Sessegnon is that when Conte first came in, I think we all kind of saw Reguilon and Sessegnon as 2 players that could really thrive in that Conte system. Like you say, with Sessegnon having that passive playing as a left wing, right wing with Fulham, that he has the attacking side of the game that Conte needs so much in a wing back. And Reguilon seems not to have made that step up, but Sessegnon sees the opportunity that he has, and he seems to be grabbing that with both hands, like the work you say he was doing over the summer. But along the lines of the player profile that Conte really wants, and before we do get on to the outgoings, there is still an argument for Spurs that we're missing a creative midfielder and an attacking player to kind of link things up between the back and the front. And look, despite Conte's insistence that not everything is going to be fixed this summer, do you see any chance that Tottenham could try and maybe bring in someone in that position? And I suppose on top of that, do you think Bissouma could be that player? Because for me, I think his ball playing skill is a bit underrated. So do you think we could maybe look for somewhere else, or is that sorted?
Well, first of all, Bissouma, I mean, I love him as a player. I think he's a really good signing, fits in really well, and he does have ability on the ball. And bear in mind, this is a player that was last season talked about hoping to be the or maybe even thinking at that point that he could be the best midfielder in the Premier League. So he definitely has high expectations of what he can do. But I also don't really think that that's his game to be that kind of playmaker going forward. So I'm not sure he would fit that profile. Regarding an attacking midfielder, I totally understand why all fans are hopeful that might happen. I wouldn't hold my breath, basically, on that happening. But as I said before, the main word I've got is if there is the right deal out there, it won't stop them going for it. But and so maybe that could fit in with an attacking midfielder. I mean, I think we're looking, when we talk about Christian Eriksen, there's obviously a lot of talk about him earlier in the summer. And many fans will have noticed that anyone who's suggesting that 3-4-3 is the only way Conte plays, they've looked at how he played at Inter with the 3-5-2, which actually seemed to accommodate Eriksen. So he has that ability to change it up. in bringing in a sort of more playmaker midfielder. But I just personally, I'm not sure I see it. I think if they could bring in a new attacking midfielder, it'd be someone who could also play out wide, because you've got to think of how much game time these guys are going to get. I mean, I'm already wondering about Richarlison, how obviously when we get into the season, you're going to have 2 games every week. You've got the Champions League, you've got all these different matches, so that they will get plenty of opportunities. But even with all that, to try and keep a squad happy, if it was just a specialist midfielder who just played as an attacking midfielder, I'm not sure I can quite see that. I think it'd be more someone who could also play out wide. And it also might depend on more players going out. I mean, we haven't talked about Brian Hill, who has featured quite a lot in pre-season and has been on the bench as well. I almost presumed that he wouldn't be on the bench against Chelsea and it would be Jed Spence who stay on the bench, but he was still on there, wasn't he, against Chelsea? I know he didn't come on, but that's interesting in itself that he's impressed enough to be in the reckoning. But if he were to leave, and there was some talks with Valencia on loan, I imagine, then maybe that might offer up an opportunity. But again, I wouldn't be betting on it, put it that way.
Can I ask you before Matty jumps back in there, Tom? Can you just clarify for us if Spurs held, as far as you're concerned, any talks with the likes of Zaniolo or Maddison this summer, just so we're clear if there's been any negotiation on these couple of players? Can you let us know?
Okay. So on Maddison, which has sort of come up quite a lot, they've been pretty insistent that there's been nothing in that, and there seems to be no interest in him, which is interesting, because you think he'd be the kind of player who could offer who could be that creative outlet, but he also could play, if not out wide, but he could play off. He could play in different positions. But as far as I'm aware, no on him. Zaniolo, I'm not personally, I can't say I'm as sure about that one, so I don't want to sort of say, for definite. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of reports out in Italy, even a suggestion about Mourinho sort of blocking a move, but I have to say I haven't had any of that firmed up, so I'm afraid I can't give you a yes on that one either way.
No, appreciate that. We'll have him back up to Matty.
I think just in typical fashion, showing that Tottenham fans are never happy. We wanted an attacking midfielder in, but we also wanted one out. And we got that in the shape of Giovanni Lo Celso, completed a loan move to Villarreal. Flew last Friday night before completing that move, which I think Villarreal kind of just snuck in after that game against Chelsea. Kind of crept out that announcement that we realised for a few hours. But as we mentioned earlier, there's no option to buy in that deal, but he can be recalled in January if Tottenham do get a permanent offer from elsewhere. Do you think that's a deal that was kind of maybe the best deal that just suited both parties in this one?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I sort of said before, I think like with all these guys that they were looking to move on, they would have preferred to have sold them. They just didn't get the offers that they've been hoping for, and they haven't with any of them so far. Hence why they had to start looking at loans instead. It's not ideal. The fact that there's no even obligation, I'm sure they would probably have hoped for that. But this way, they don't, as I think Ricky said from the beginning about questions about having these players who are not involved around the camp is not ideal, regardless of what their character is like, because it's, you don't want players who are not going to feature. It's not good for them. It's not good for anyone. So I think, I imagine the wages of some of these guys are pretty high. So that alleviates some of the finance on that point of view. But it feels like with the Celso, to a certain extent, it's kind of kicking the problem further down the road. Give them another see how he goes for the first half of the season. Albeit he played very well last season, as I said, he helped them get to the Champions League semi-final. But see how he gets on first half of the season. They have a chance to bring him back, and if there is some interest either from Villarreal want to try to sign him permanently, or if another club comes in for him, and maybe they can look to get reclaim some money at that point.
And Ndombele. Tom, obviously, we briefly touched upon him. Matty touched upon him as well. It looks like now he's going to leave the club to some degree. That's on loan. Napoli seems to be the club that are closing in on him. Anything more you can tell us about how advanced? I think you said earlier it's not as close as what some are reporting out there. So, from your understanding, just how close is that move at the moment to Napoli?
I don't think that's very close. I don't think it's as close as some are perhaps suggesting. I think there's a long way to go in negotiations on that front. He's a player that was, Tottenham's record signing. He's on big wages, so that's a big part of it. So there are definitely talks with Napoli. That's 100% correct. But as I said before, suggestions that he's already in Italy and it's wrapped up aren't correct. He's still in London. It's still at the in talks stage, put it that way. So I think there's definitely a willingness on Tottenham's part, as I've said before, to move him on. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but obviously they prefer to have a transfer fee come in, but if not, then they'll look for loans and options and things like that, and hopefully obligations. And Napoli would be a great move. I mean, I don't know. You guys watched Ndombele every week when he's played, much more than me. I've kind of over the last few years, I've been to some Spurs games before I started covering them regularly. And obviously watch all the highlights, and I remember the goal that he scored. I remember watching the game against Sheffield United with that amazing lob. Incredible player, but I don't know. I mean, how do you look back on his time if whatever happens to him, really?
I don't know, Matt, you want to go first?
Yeah, I just think it's a case of what should have been, what could have been, what should have been, because there's no doubt in that, for me anyway, Ndombele is one of the most technically gifted players that I've seen in my 12 years of supporting Spurs. He's I think a player that we identified to maybe be that Moussa Dembele replacement, in that in the middle of the park he can do the defensive side, he can do the offensive side. He's difficult to really move off the ball, but he just never seemed to have the mentality or the willingness to do on the pitch what we know he really can. And it is the most frustrating thing when you see him scoring goals like that against Sheffield United. I remember his goal against Aston Villa on his debut as well. He's had some games where he has been exactly what we needed in the middle of the park and exactly what we have been crying out for years. But I don't know if he's struggling to adapt to the English game, to the English culture, if it's a thing maybe within the club. I think we saw in the Amazon documentary that he tried to leave after the first season and had to be convinced by the player liaison officer and Daniel Levy. There's something just hasn't quite been right for the whole time that he's been there. And I don't think I'd call it a failure of the recruitment team, because he was a highly sought after player. The money, maybe in hindsight, you can obviously say was questionable, but it was a transfer we were all really excited about, and one that we were happy we got over the line quickly to kind of get rid of the pressure that we could have had from a City or a PSG with them trying to sign him as well. But I think it's just coming to an end in the way that it has, to, and just him kind of leaving the club. And I'd say every Tottenham fan would have said after that FA Cup game against Morecambe in January that it's best that we never see him in a Spurs jersey again. But it's annoying, because he's an incredibly talented player.
It's a real shame, Tom, for me, because I agree with every word that Matty says there. And for me, he's exactly the kind of player that we can actually do with now as an alternative option when you need somebody that's going to change a game for you, that's going to play the eye of the needle ball. He, for me, is the player. And that's why I'm so desperately disappointed. And I was one of those guys to the very end that was trying to, reason why we should still have faith in him. But it came to the point where, like Matty says, I mean, after Morecambe, you couldn't defend him. I mean, listen, it was beyond the defendable what happened that day. I mean, again, when there's 50 to 60,000 turned against you for walking off so slowly, when Spurs are losing an FA Cup tie against a lower league side, I just didn't see there was going to ever be a way back for him, which is a real shame. I'm surprised that he's even considering Napoli, because I feel with Ndombele, he's a player that has got a really high expectation of where he thinks he should go to play. So I'm listening, not that Napoli are a bad club or a poor club, but I'm quite surprised that he's willing to accept that. But maybe it's just a case where he'll take that now to get his footballing career back on, because as I said earlier, it can't be great that these players are around, Reguilon, Winks. It can't be good for their mental health, even that they're around these players that are playing week in, week out, and these guys are waiting to kind of restart their career. It just can't be ideal. And the same for Ndombele, as much as we're frustrated that maybe he lacks the footballing desire from a Spurs perspective, for their own guys' mental health, it just can't be ideal.
No, I think all players want to play, and a player like Ndombele, I mean, first of all, I think we've seen a few players come into the Premier League recently who we just presume will go and be fantastic in it. And sometimes you sort of realise that the level of the Premier League is higher than you maybe give it credit for. I mean, I'm thinking of the likes of Jadon Sancho. I know Man United have been a basket case. I'm not saying he won't be a success in the future, but I don't know. I think there's sort of a bit of a we're sort of reappraising his talent maybe, and having seen him play enough to realise that maybe he's not quite. Maybe the Bundesliga is just not quite as strong as the Premier League. Romelu Lukaku, the same kind of situation. But Ndombele, as you say, that's the thing with him, isn't it? Is he's got that little bit of magic, as Glenn Hodder would say, that can unlock a door, can be that creative midfielder that you're talking about. Whereas I guess Lo Celso's never really had any of those kind of moments, so he's less bothered about him moving on. Whereas Ndombele, there's still the Ndombelievers, I think as Jack calls them, still out there. Maybe not so much anymore after Morecambe, but that was the sort of fear, that kind of what's the opposite of buyer's remorse, which is probably what you have at the moment. But if you do sell him and then he goes and he shows what you've seen in glimpses regularly somewhere else. But I do think when you look at the fact that quite a few managers haven't fancied him, that normally tells you something. But for the sake of just pure aesthetically loving football and a player that can do special things, you want him to go somewhere and make it happen, and then let's see what happens in the future. Yep. But yeah, as of now, you can't see Spurs can't be happening at Tottenham.
No, agree. What we will just do is we will just go for our next break of the show for our listeners and audio. For our watchers on YouTube, there's still a good 500 of you plus watching us live across all of our platforms. So thank you so much again for all your support from Last Word on Spurs. Now, we haven't mentioned them tonight, and we should have done. And it's just a quick shout out to our sponsors for this evening. That is the Beavertown. And that's the Beavertown corner pin bang opposite your South Stand, the Spurs Stadium. We're very excited to get down there for some amazing screening of Spurs televised away games. Of course, they've got the pre-match DJs playing, the fan favourites in the garden, giant telly, great food, great people. You can book your spot now for the next away televised game for Spurs, which I'm led to believe is Forest to come. So if you go to www.beavertownbrewery.co.uk/pages/corner pin, you can book your spot right now to see Spurs home win away on the Beavertown feature. So make sure you get yourself back down there for that. And there was a lot of fun down there this weekend. There was a Tottenham tour, which took place very, very early morning, very, very rowdy. We then dropped off some at Stamford Bridge, some went to Beavertown. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And I'm going to hand back over to Matty.
Speaking about Ndombele there before the break, but another Spurs player who's linked to the move to Italy this summer is Japhet Tanganga. Just as an interesting side note, living in the southwest of Ireland, I see probably a handful of Spurs jerseys around the place every year. I saw someone with a new Spurs jersey with Tanganga on the back of it earlier today, which I have to say was a bit of a surprise walking into the shop on my lunch. But look, he's been linked heavily with AC Milan. I think AC Milan wanted a loan with a view to a permanent deal, but Spurs wanting something more permanent decided to reject that offer. And as we were speaking about earlier with the homegrown quota and how finally Tottenham are balanced on the line with that one, do you expect Tanganga to potentially be a player to move on this summer? And what kind of structure do you think we might see in a deal if it is to materialise?
I don't know if there's like a massive desire to move him on. He did feature quite heavily in the early Conte time when he at Spurs. I know he obviously got injured after that, and injuries have been the main frustration of his career, and he's going to have to sort of make sure he can overcome that. If which is one of the real shames of professional players when they have regular injuries. But hopefully, after coming back from last season, he can get some regular minutes or be available regularly. And the fact that he's been on the bench for the first two games shows that he's still seems to be within Conte's thoughts. He knows he can trust him. He's interested. He's another player we spoke to out in Korea. One of the takeaways from his little interview was that Conte sees him as either on the left or the right, not in the middle. So not a dire backup. It would be one of the other two positions. And if there has been a lot of speculation about moves to Italy. There have obviously been lots of examples of English players doing well out there, and I guess Fikayo Tomori would be the biggest sort of example because he was centre back as well, who's obviously done brilliantly since going to Milan. But if he were to go, it's not the primary thing that would be an issue. Would be that homegrown quota that I mentioned before, albeit I suppose Harvey White could fill in there if needs be. But it's also the fact that they've let Joe Rodon go, and that Ren move's an interesting one. Given just interesting that he's gone there. It sounds like, I think this has been mentioned with a few other guys, that that club is one of the most heavily scouted clubs in Europe. So whilst that might have seemed a bit of an odd destination, that is part of the reason. Like, you think of some of the players that have come through at that club, like Rafinha, I think Edouard Mendy was there before. That almost puts him in the shop window going to that particular club. But anyway, the fact that they let him go means they're another centre-back down, and Conte's been very adamant about wanting 2 players in each position. And so if you let Tanganga go, then you'd be down to 5, wouldn't you? Unless you're talking about Emerson playing in a back 3, which I'm not sure many Spurs fans would be keen on. So then they would have to probably look.
I think he's scaring people enough playing as a right wing back at the moment, Tom. I think he's terrified people enough as a right wing back.
He was pretty good in that first game, I thought.
He was. You know, I think Emerson. I
thought he was all right against Southampton.
I've always said with Emerson, I've got no problem with him defensively. I think going forward, it's where people need to take a bit of a rain check. But I don't know what people's thoughts are putting him as a centre back. That might be a completely different element to it. But listen, again, he's a player that does try very, very hard, Emerson. And as I've always said, I mean, I know the problem is I say we've been lucky enough to do Last Word on Spurs for the last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, Spurs in the 90s, if you think we had bad defenders now, some of them, you want to go back to them. I mean, we honestly, it makes our defence look elite, some of them now. So I'm very conscious that, you know, Emerson, as people might not rate him to some degree, believe me, we had far, far worse than Emerson Royale. We really, really have. And actually, that brings me to another player that I think definitely over the last year or two, I'm sure Matty will agree as well, has had a real scapegoat, and that's probably Harry Winks. I think it's a shame, really, with Winksy, what's happened to him, because this was a player that actually was playing regularly for Tottenham in the Champions League. People actually forget that, I think, with Winks. He actually started Spurs' Champions League final. People can't forget, against Liverpool. So to find himself now not only in the periphery of the squad, but to really be at a point where Conte doesn't feel he's good enough to be part of the squad. And it's a shame. He is a player that was a homegrown talent. He came through the academy, nurtured by Pochettino. Are you surprised that it's taken this long so far to get Winks a move, Tom? Because it does feel like this one is inching towards even deadline day. Can you see it going that long at the moment, Tom? What do you reckon?
Well, so first of all, yes, I am surprised that it's taken this long. He's in England. He's got, well, all right, he seems to be a long way away from the England picture right now, but he has, was it nearly 10 caps? I mean, he's got that creativity that you would think would be attractive to a lot of teams, and his age profile, I think he's 26 or 25, 26. You know, he should have a lot of football left in him. He's a very experienced player at Premier League level. Yeah, it does seem odd that a move hasn't come about. There were definitely talks with Everton during the window, but that obviously didn't come to anything, and they've now signed a new central midfielder anyway. So I think that you can probably write that one off. And yes, to answer your second question, I wouldn't be surprised, as with quite a few of these players, if Spurs didn't end up being quite busy on deadline day. Given it's 2 weeks to it now, with quite a few of their outgoings, and Winks would probably be the prime candidate for that. As I've sort of alluded to before, there's been some sort of tentative interest from, at least I believe, from abroad, and there are some Premier League teams monitoring him. So let's see if that comes to pass. But I mean, it would. I mean, you guys, Spurs fans, have been watching him for a long time. So if you don't think he's sort of good enough for Spurs anymore, it's totally, you know, it's fair enough. But I remember him playing pretty well against Liverpool. Was it the 2-2 draw back under Conte? So I think that in itself sort of proved that he's still got lots of ability. He just needs to show it on a regular basis. He needs to move where he can do that, and I still think that he can do a job definitely in the Premier League. So
can I ask you, Tom,
again, that it happens for
just one final thing before Matty comes in there, just on Winks. Can you just confirm, has anybody held any official talks from this summer? There was talks that Everton looked at him, but done their further due diligence and then backed off. Can you give us some clarity as far as you're concerned? Has anybody had a bid or anybody in talks with him at all?
No, I believe Everton, that those talks were correct, and it obviously didn't happen in the end. They moved on, but I don't think there's been anything else since. So when I talk about sort of tentative interest, it's more, you know, clubs are looking at him, but there hasn't been any sort of official moves or anything, or talks with the club. So that definitely feels like one that's gonna run and run. You know, for example, Southampton, I knew were one of the teams that quite liked the look of him, but they didn't need. That wasn't like a key position for them this summer. And when you were previously in the window, when we were talking about sort of Spurs looking for sort of 20 million for him, it's not the kind of that's a big part of Southampton's budget, for example. They're not going to blow it on a player that they didn't, a position that isn't a priority. When you think of James Ward-Prowse plays there, so that's just one example of a club that would probably be interested. And then if a loan comes up, then which is where we're moving to now, then maybe things can be different. But at this stage, I'm not led to believe there's been any sort of concrete anyone moving on from or stepping up any interest in him. So yeah, a long way to go, it seems, for Harry Winks.
It's interesting that you bring up that draw with Liverpool and back at Conte when he started. Because am I right in saying that midfield was Winks and Ndombele and Dele Alli? I think that started that game. It
crazy, yeah.
Such a good performance, a far cry from where we are now. But onto Sergio Reguilón, Tom, as we've already mentioned, we've seen speculation kind of throughout the window that Sevilla had been interested in maybe bringing him back to where he had his glory days. Spent the 2019-20 season on loan there from Real Madrid. He's played 67 games for Spurs across 2 seasons. Has been heavily involved and a lot under Antonio Conte towards the middle of last season as well. Contributing to 9 goals, including a big one against Leeds. Is that a player again that you expect to leave Tottenham this summer, and one that we could just go with a loan deal if we are forced to do so?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting when I think you alluded to it earlier, Matty, that when Conte came in, everyone was sort of thinking, particularly from a sort of fantasy football point of view, oh, right, get Reguilón in because he's going to fit beautifully into this left wing back position, going to create and everything. I just don't know if he's got the physicality as part of his game, and whether he's defensively good enough as well. And in disciplined, there's all these parts that he's more sort of a good technician on the ball for a fullback or wing back. But maybe he sort of lacks that side of the game. When you look at the player that Sessegnon, if he can avoid injuries, is turning himself into, and Perisic, I mean, he's physically imposing, he's stamina, he's got everything about him. And that's before you talk about his mindset, which seems to sort of elevate him to the next level of a player. I mean, we all think back to, well, maybe not you, Matty, I'm presuming you're not an England fan based on the accent, but most of us who are England fans look back on that semi-final against Croatia, not in the best way, but that kind of sums up Perisic in the way that, England took the lead and were looking strong. He just didn't give up. And that mentality, I think he was spurring on the Croatian team in that game, and I think that's the kind of thing that we can see when he comes, or hope to see when he comes to play for Spurs regularly. I mean, maybe we saw it yesterday. I mean, obviously his corner set up Kane's goal, and that kind of winning mentality is something that that Spurs fans can really be excited to see. But as for regards for Reguilón, I mean, look, you only have to do the numbers. They've already got Sessegnon, Perisic, and they've just about to sign another left wing back. So it doesn't look his future doesn't look bright from a Tottenham point of view.
No, absolutely not. Another player, I mean, listen, he's been linked with a move away this summer, but we're hearing reports coming out this evening from Spain suggesting that Spurs may have actually stopped a potential exit for him, and that's Bryan Gil. I mean, you referenced Tom only a short time ago that essentially, was on the bench yesterday again. Obviously, he did have a bright cameo before the last time Spurs met Chelsea, before yesterday's game. It does feel potentially he might get minutes, maybe in terms of Carabao Cup, maybe cameos, in the Premier League as well. From what you're hearing, Tom, and based on what we've heard tonight, do you think it's looking more and more likely that Bryan Gil remains a Spurs player before the end of the window?
I'm not sure on Bryan Gil. I mean, I'm pretty sure there were talks with Valencia, but that is interesting that you're saying about maybe that Spurs have changed their mind on that. I don't know if that's true. I haven't had a chance to check it out on that one. But Bryan Gil's an interesting player because when I was out in Korea and we were watching that open training session, which has obviously made a lot of headlines about the running at the end of the session, which was honestly quite a thing to behold, watching the likes of Harry Kane and Son, in what looked like real bad in a bad way. And as Conte has pointed out quite a few times since, and other players, it's just you don't get to see this very often. This is what we always do. This is very normal. But it was quite. I don't know, as a sort of part-time, five-a-side player, who's often struggling to get around the pitch. It was quite a nice leveler to see these like absolute what you think of as athletes struggling for once, which was quite nice. But anyway, the reason I bring it up is Brian Hill was one of the players who really did really impress in those running drills. He was one of the fittest of the lot. He was quite heavily involved in the practice throughout the hour and a half before, and you got to sort of get the sense that maybe Conte's not like 100% convinced. He's probably not the kind of player that maybe he would have signed if it was down to him. Just look at his lack of physicality, I suppose. I mean, we did a piece recently. It's funny that Matty mentions the size of some of the players that have come in. And this is something that Ledley King, another obviously legend for Spurs, someone else that we spoke to during career, the point he made was when looking at the Spurs team now is how physically imposing they all are. They're all pretty much 6 foot or more. There are only a few that aren't, Lucas Moura, Brian Hill, obviously. And there's a couple that are like 5'11", so they're not even that far off it, like Sessegnon. But so that, Conte clearly likes, physically imposing players and you can see why. So Hill perhaps doesn't really fit that mold, but then being physical isn't just about having sort of muscles, it's also having great stamina. And as I just said, he showed that he's up there on the fitness side of things, and he sort of did enough really to be in the picture, to be on the bench for these games. As I said before, I was kind of expecting him to drop out and when Richarlison's suspension was over, but no, he was on the bench. He didn't come off it, but it was enough to suggest that they still have some belief in him. I personally think that if the right move comes up and maybe this could open the door for a new signing, then maybe it could still happen. But I also wouldn't be surprised if he was in and around the picture, very much as a backup player, to be fair, given the competition he's up against. But fair play to him, really, because I'm not sure too many fans would have thought he would have had that much of a future last season.
Yeah, I think Hill is certainly an interesting one. For me, he kind of fits into a very similar bracket to Pape Matar Sarr, a player who was brought in last summer. Hill definitely got more of a chance, of course, in the first team earlier in the window. Sarr was loaned straight back out to Metz, and if I'm not mistaken, I think he was another one of those players that impressed during the sprinting drills in Korea. But Sarr, yet to make the debut for the first team, for me looked comfortable in the preseason games. Didn't really stand out in terms of quality, but he looked comfortable. He kind of looked like he fit in, and there's been maybe differing feelings on whether or not he could head back out on loan for this season. Have you heard anything on that, or do you think it could be one that could benefit the player?
I think he might go out on loan. I think Conte talked about him maybe on Sunday. I was at the game, but I was out doing the Højbjerg, and there's a Ben Davis interview that's going to come out in about an hour. That we did speak to the game after the game. So I must have missed this, but I think Ali Gold was mentioning something about him referencing Sarr and what sort of potential he had. I'm quite sure how that would have come up after the game, but anyway. And he's a player that's well liked, and there are lots of clubs that are interested in him. But as you're right, I think I was expecting to see quite a bit of him in pre-season, and he also did well in the fitness drills, but he didn't really get that much of a look in. And this is what I come back to when we're talking about this, the hope of a new creative midfielder coming in. They have a lot in that they've 4 nailed on for these 2 positions, and unless you change the formation, right, maybe there's a possibility, but I'm not sure how much that's going to happen. And the fact that Sarr didn't even get a look in, all right, he's not like he wouldn't be the same as a new £50 million signing if that happens. Then I guess that that is a slightly different situation if that were to happen. But I was kind of expecting that I'd see a bit more of him in pre-season, given how highly he's rated, and it really sort of feels like his lack of involvement so far would suggest a loan is quite likely. So we'll see.
Tom, before we look to close the show, I think it's silly to ask about how many players you think Spurs are going to sign next. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that it's a case of opportunities now rather than a case of how many, 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5. Just want to give you an opportunity to talk about Oliver Skipp, a player you've watched very closely, the same as Sessegnon as well. Obviously, Skip out at the moment for injury. Do you have any concerns, Tom, long term over Skip and injuries? It just seems that obviously the last couple of occasions, obviously the pelvic situation last season. I know obviously this was a completely different type of injury that he sustained this time, more again of an accidental injury that's happened in training. But I think already Spurs fans are starting to get a little bit concerned that Skip has missed a couple of chunks in terms of periods of games. Any concern, Tom, long term over his fitness and keeping him fit?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, Ricky. I mean, the injury that he's got at the moment is completely nothing related to the pelvic thing at all. So it's not really fair to say he's got a problem with injuries or the same thing keeps cropping up. It was a bit of a freak situation where he gets this nasty cut on his really bad on his foot, and it just takes a bit of time to recover from. So it's just unfortunate more than anything, because he's a player that the club and Conte have huge faith in. Back end of last season, when I just started covering them, and obviously there was, on a bit of a roll with what ended up with a sort of march towards the Champions League, and generally he was picking the same team, wasn't he? Once it became one game every week, and this target was at the forefront of their minds. But he kept mentioning Skip, even when the suggestion was that, is it best just to leave him for the rest of the season, let him recover? He was saying, no, I want to get him back if I can. I want to put that goal in front of him to get him back. And that showed how much he rates him personally. And obviously it didn't happen. It didn't recover in time. But you can see from pre-season how much he likes the way he plays. He's just a really dependable holding midfielder who also likes to get things moving. As I said, as you said, Ricky, I cover the under-21s, and I've watched him a bit for them, but because of his injuries, he's missed quite a lot of those games in the last couple of years. Although he was quite involved in the under-21 Euros, which ended up being last year, which was a bit of a disaster, to be honest, from England's point of view. But he always looks a very tidy holding midfielder who seems to have grown more and more. And as I said, I can more go on like how people seem to rate him within the club. That sort of speaks to how exciting he could be and how he probably is a player who should be looking, if he can fulfill his potential, he should be playing for the full England senior team in not too distant future, because of how dependable he is in that position. And I don't think it's fair to sort of suggest that he's got some sort of injury problem just because he's out now with that problem. If the pelvic thing came up again, then maybe you could argue that. But from everything I'm told, he's fully recovered from that. It just took longer than they were hoping. There was a situation where they tried to do injections. The injections didn't work, so then he had to have surgery. So it was just one of those nagging things which they hoped would have been solved by one solution that didn't end up working. So they had to go for a different route, and that just made it take a lot longer than it did. And maybe if they'd known from the offset that they should have just gone straight to that, he would have been back quicker. But hindsight's in 2020. So I think he's someone that I'm really excited about seeing, who has very much a good chance of starting in that two as much as any of the other three central holding midfielders, and that shows you how highly he is rated.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to allow Matty to close the show with a question about potentially challenging. Matty, we'll hand over to you and let you go away.
I always feel bad asking this question because I know it's such a difficult one with the unpredictability of the Premier League season. We're even seeing it now with Liverpool struggling against Palace. But do you think Conte really feels that this squad that he has in place now can challenge for the Premier League title? And what I'm most interested in is do you think that Spurs can go that extra distance this season?
Okay, so on the first question, this is something we basically asked him all summer in various different ways, trying to get him to say something. And the thing with what I've learned quite quickly with Antonio is he says what he wants to say. It almost doesn't sometimes matter what the question is. He already knows what he's going to say. And something like that, he can sort of spot a mile off when we're trying to get him to talk about, whether they really can challenge and take on City and Liverpool. And interestingly, throughout the summer, whenever we talked about bridging that gap to City and Liverpool, he kept saying, don't forget about Chelsea. Don't forget about Chelsea. They won the Club World Cup. They won the Champions League not long ago. And whilst we're all going, it's summer, season of transition, forget about Chelsea. He's definitely said, don't do that. And I think yesterday was sort of proved him right, really, because Spurs were quite lucky to get a result really in the end, and Chelsea looked very good in that first half. But I don't know. He's the main things he said is wanting to be competitive in every game. You can take from that what you will, whether you think that means competitive to actually win trophies or not. But he's never going to come out and say, "Oh, I think we can win." But look, this is a guy who is not only a proven winner, but he is so ambitious, but also doesn't hang around long if he doesn't see that ambition met, which is what we all experienced back in the last season. Even after, I remember being at Norwich after Champions League football being confirmed, and we were asking him the question, now will you commit to staying? And he still was like, well, let's see how the summer goes. And obviously he ended up being, placated by all the new signings, and he looks very happy. And so fingers crossed going forward. And I think the fact that he is still here and looking so enthused by it and saying comments like, we can build over the next few years, suggests that he really does think Spurs are going places. But I doubt he would think that they can actually challenge this season unless they go on an incredible run and other teams have a bad season, which is really probably what Tottenham rely on. And that kind of, you asked my own opinion. Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing. I really can't see City and Liverpool, or at least City. I mean, we'll see with Liverpool. They're having a bad start, aren't they? But dropping off enough to make that gap. And that's nothing against Tottenham. They seem to be building in a really, really impressive way. And they've got a much stronger squad, and they should improve. They should. I like to see them kick on, and I think they should be in a good position to finish in the top 4 again this season. But that's a big ask. But next few years they start to keep signing the right players, stick with Conte, keep him going, then there might be a different kettle of fish.
It will be the key. Tom, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. It's getting to that time of the window now, as you can tell, where everybody it's just slowing down slightly, and this is the nature of it now. Matty, we started off on such an incredible amount of players coming in that now it's just a case of getting rid of those players that need moves, and then I guess, Matty, seeing what opportunities are out there, right, even for your channel as well. Yeah,
look, this is usually the time of the window where Daniel Levy decides to, get out of bed and start making things happen. But everything is done now, and it's a relaxing feeling, and it's weird having that. Look, we know that there are still improvements to be made, and again, go back to Conte's comments. It would be foolish to think it could all be done in this summer, but it's just a window that we've seen. Perhaps a lot of stability coming back into that squad, and a little bit of depth. We're starting to put together a few little bits that could help us move into that top 4. But it's going to be a nice, peaceful end to the window. Hopefully with a surprise or two. But it's been an enjoyable.
Yeah, you never know. You never know with Tottenham. Like I said, you never know with Tottenham. And like I said before, if the right player comes up, is what's been sort of suggested to me. If the right player comes up, then I wouldn't rule it out. So, but also try not to be too disappointed if it doesn't happen, because I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't.
That's the way you do it, Tom. Leave us on a cliffhanger. That's he's been trained to do that, hasn't he? He's been trained to do that. Leave us on a cliffhanger. Before we go over to Tom, Matty, just where can everybody find the great work you do, Matty? Where can one check out, obviously, the great content you provide? Thank
you very much, Ricky. My channel is Matt Hayes Tottenham Blog. I just love transfers, to be honest. So there'll be a lot of coverage of that. Hopefully, an analysis of Destiny Udogie, who we're hoping to sign, and looking as well at where the likes of Ndombele, Winks, and Reguilon might end up for the rest of this window. But as always, Ricky, a pleasure coming on here, and Tom, a pleasure chatting to you tonight. And hopefully there'll be a lot of news for you to put out there in the next couple of weeks. But
yeah, we're hoping so. We're hoping so. Fingers crossed. Tom, been a real pleasure having you on Last Word on Spurs. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. Tom, where can everybody find the content you provide to the Spurs community? Where can everybody find the great work you do?
Well, I mean, pick up the newspaper, The Sun, I guess, for the first protocol, or the website. But my personal Twitter is at Tom Barclay _. So go on to that, and I'm sort of building up my Spurs following, I suppose, over the last few months, and it'll be something I'm trying to do more of. So thanks very much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it, Ricky. And if you want me on in the future, let me know.
Absolute pleasure, guys. Like I say, thank you so much for your time this evening. We know we've been battling Ford, M&F, so thank you so much as always. Lots of love in the comments for Matty, for Tom. Guys, we're back with you later in the week, of course, previewing Wolves to come for Spurs at the weekend. Can we continue our strong start to the season? We shall see. From Matty, from Tom, from myself, guys, please keep safe, keep well, and as always, come on you Spurs.